So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. My name is Mingzi, and I'm part of the Legal Voices Organizing Committee. And today we're very glad to be welcoming Tim MacDonald and Chris Foreman for our session on Is Growth Fiduciary? Just a bit about Legal Voices. We are a collaborative knowledge sharing and networking forum. We were established in January 2023 by junior practitioners from different fields of law. And our objective is to really give voice to young lawyers on the pressing issues that face us today, and allow them to get the benefit of high quality education and enable them to connect with like-minded peers. Next slide, please. Just in terms of housekeeping, we'd like you guys to mute yourselves to avoid any interruptions. And as you've heard just now, the first two sections will be recorded, but the final creative content sections, we'll be breaking out into breakout rooms, will not be recorded. So we do encourage you to put your videos on for the breakout rooms. Next slide, please. And just in terms of an agenda, we'll first have a presentation by Tim, forward to Tim in conversation with Chris, our speaker, and then finally we'll move on to some creative content on fiduciary duties and growth. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Mingzi. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, the Legal Voices community, to focus on a topic that I think is extremely important and timely, but probably not very much on people's mind right now. In terms of how I got here, a quick introduction because we're short for time. But if you read from the bottom of the resume, I'm Boston-based, Boston educated. I started out, I am licensed to practice in Massachusetts, although I don't really practice so much anymore. I started my career in a general practice, got an advanced degree in taxation, and came back to Boston to develop a specialty practice in what was called tax partnership syndications for individual investors. I left private practice and went to work for a syndicator, a client of the firm actually, until 1986 when the tax law changed and that individual business went away. I spent a short amount of time actually trying to become a stockbroker because I felt like I wanted to learn how to sell and I wanted to know more about how this business of Wall Street works from the inside. And I learned that stockbrokering is largely a telemarketing business, and I'm a terrible telemarketer. So I went back into the practice of law. This time I went and looked into more emerging technology, sort of early stage development companies in the advanced materials space, and eventually found myself back in tax and finance, where I was doing financing transactions, tax credit partnerships for renewable energy, some really big cutting edge stuff in financing wind power projects and solar projects, as well as other technologies. I am a co-founder of a boutique law firm for some young lawyers who are friends of mine that I'm more emeritus in, because mostly what I do now is work with this Bank of Nature activity where we are exploring sort of what's next in sustainability. And I'm arguing that pensions and changes in how pensions finance the economy is going to bring stewardship in as what's next in sustainability. So if we could have the next slide. I want to acknowledge this is very frontier thinking. This is cutting edge stuff, but I think it's also a very timely proposition. And I'll point to Make My Money Matter, which is an advocacy group based in the UK. They did a study. They're particularly focused on pensions. They see the power that pensions have that could be used for climate action that is really not being used for climate action right now. And one interesting thing that's very current, this was a month or so ago, they produced a report talking about how much money just the British pension industry could solve. That report got a little bit of coverage in Reuters, and I wanted to use two sentences out of that Reuters news report on it to kind of tee things up for what I wanted to point to Legal Voices with. And they talk here, as you can see, about the old law of low risk government bonds as where pension money should go, which is a kind of sleepy topic that's not very interesting. And then the new law of economic growth, which is where people are trying to push pensions, and pensions are largely in, that they've only been there really for the last 40 or 50 years. Pensions have been around for over 150 years, but they've been in the markets for only 40 or 50 years. And what I want to talk to you today about is what the law actually says about both this older law and this newer law. Before we switch that to the history of the law, just some timely issues here. COP just wrapped up, and it was historic in that they have finally got some language, including the fossil fuel industry acknowledging we have to transition away. And I think that the just, orderly, and equitable manner is important, because the orderly qualification is the most troublesome. If we use existing financing growth techniques to finance this transition, growth finances created destruction, and destruction is not orderly. Pensions are stewards, and they should be financing an orderly transition. Another thing that's happening real world time with a UK orientation is water problems. You may not know, but back in Thatcher days in the UK, water services were privatized into a growth mode, and they're seeing lots of signs now that that experiment with growth financing for something as basic as water is failing. And the question is, what do we do next? And one opportunity is that we go from ownership to stewardship rather than going back into government management. So some very, very current and big issues that I think circle around this somewhat esoteric topic. So next slide now. I want to quickly just go sort of through the law as it has developed. Fiduciary duty is a very, very old law going back to the Middle Ages. And for hundreds of years now, it's been fairly settled, except for there's this back and forth between a construct called a legal list, where the court decides what is prudent, and the prudent person, which is a more of an evidentiary standard. And that, for the longest time was sort of a very specialized topic. But back in 1969, the Ford Foundation started to say, well, wait a minute, we've got all this money in endowments for universities locked in this old lore of low interest government bonds. Couldn't we put them into Wall Street where they could make a lot more money? And that would mean their endowments could provide much more support to their universities, and good things would come. So they commissioned two lawyers, Carey and Bright, to do a study of the law, and they produced this report that it is the prudent person that the law actually requires, that the legal list, which is constraining investing back in that time, is really a court convention, but it's not what the law says. 3 years later, here in the US, the Uniform Management of Institutional Funds Act was promulgated as a state level law, model law that has been enacted in almost every state now, to clarify that the standard is the prudent person. And so following on from 1972, we got this new law that started to talk about a prudent investor replacing the prudent person. And Keith Johnson is a emeritus pension lawyer who has flagged this as a concern. As he says it, the investment professionals have basically pushed out the attorneys from interpreting fiduciary duty. My call to young lawyers and all lawyers is that we attorneys have to push back in and have to reassert control over what the law of fiduciary duty requires. Kind of fast forwarding to some things that are happening now, an interesting case that I find is important from 1984, a high court case in the Cowan decision, was faced with a challenge to pensions for the coal industry. Actually, were being pressured to put financing into the coal companies that were not doing well financially, on the argument that that would create job security for current workers. And what the court came back and said very clearly is, no, the purpose of the pension is not job security for current workers, it's income security in retirement for retired workers. And if the fiduciaries do not want to put their money into subsidizing a struggling coal company. They have no obligation to do that. And there was some language in there that's showing up in the ESG conversations we're watching around today about it being in the financial best interest of the beneficiaries of the pension system. And I think that's an origin of some language we're going to run into a little bit later that's, I think, problematic. Zipping forward again to just last year, the High Court decided in Butler-Sloss a controversy over ESG, over environmental, social, and governance considerations as a filter in pension financing choices. And Butler-Sloss confirmed that there is nothing wrong with a fiduciary choosing to align their values with their financing choices and using filters like ESG. But over in the US, this year, we've been seeing these sort of red state attorneys general coming in, trying to argue that the duty under the law is to be purely pecuniary. It's just about numbers. And it's solely in the best interest, the financial best interest of the beneficiaries, I think, that coming out of the Cowen language, which raises some interesting questions I want to focus your attention on as to who are the beneficiaries and what really is their financial best interest. And, you know, going to really extreme things, we've now got a proxy lawsuit filed by the hydrocarbons industry against the New York City Employees Plan, actually trying to get a court to declare that it is non-fiduciary for a pension to choose to divest from fossil fuels, and seeking the court to order the New York City plan to repurchase the oil stocks that they sold when they made their decision to invest, which I think is a really tremendous shock to any interpretation of fiduciary duty. So next slide, please, Isabel. So I want to, you know, bring this a little bit to the bread and butter of what's going on here. We've got big issues in water and light, keeping the lights on, keeping the water flowing. And we can see that these are very personal and private issues, everyday matters. When we go to the sink in the morning to wash our face, we want to know the lights will turn on and there'll be water in the sink. And then we've got these giant global convenings, like COP28, dealing with these new stress points in our relationship with nature and really with each other. And I'm pointing to pensions as a powerful social structure that is invisible right now, that needs to be brought forward with the power to mediate these stresses. Next slide, please, Isabel. And what's important here to appreciate is just how much money has been accumulated in the pension and retirement space more broadly. And the Make My Money Matter report that we started out with is talking about almost $2 trillion in pensions in the UK alone, another almost $2 trillion in retirement savings. So you're talking about really huge amounts of money. Here in the US, it's even bigger. Just our public sector pension funds control somewhere between $4 and $5 trillion. And the OECD has estimated something like 24 trillion collectively worldwide in pension benefits. And in addition to that, there are retirement savings of 26 trillion. So this is an enormous amount of money. And I think it's important to spend a moment to understand the difference between, oh, sorry, Isabel, let's go on. Yeah, pensions and retirement savings. And we'll kind of talk more about pensions, but I want you to appreciate that a pension is earned compensation and that it's provided through a aggregation of society's shared savings into social super funds for social purposes. And all of that money is given to the discretionary authority of these fiduciaries, and there's institutional accountability for what these fiduciaries do, because this is a social construct. And what we're going to talk about is the power that they have to engage in cash flow financings, not growth-based financings, which makes them a force for structuring our future in really exciting ways. And it creates an opportunity for lawyers, young lawyers and more advanced lawyers alike, to speak for the future, with a voice for the future, through the accountability of pensions for what they do with all this money that they control. A retirement savings account is just money saved from our earnings. It's an individual savings program. It's held in private accounts. It's held for private purposes. It is held through a custodial administrative function, not a discretionary authority function. And it is really about individual determination for where our money goes. But it has tremendous ability as a force multiplier to pensions that can create these investments. And then retirement savings, which are also pegged to the future, have very similar purposes, but different structures, can participate in what I call sidecar funds. So there's a lot of money that could be mobilized in ways that it's not being mobilized right now. So next. So let's talk about what the actual pension is. Mingzi, how are we doing for time?
We've got 6 minutes left.
Okay. The first thing I want you to appreciate is the pension is a promise. There are promisors and promisees. This is a promise that is made for consideration, and therefore it's a binding contract. And this promise has a lot of participants in it. So when we talk about the best interest of the beneficiaries, we have to be aware that beneficiaries include the youngest new hire, for whom pensions are a very distant concern, and the oldest longtime retiree, who maybe doesn't have that many more pension checks to receive. So you've got these very long-term horizons that you've got to accommodate, and these very short-term horizons. And then in addition, we all as citizens and taxpayers have an interest in this construct, because particularly with public pensions, as taxpayers, we're ultimately paying for this promise. And as citizens, we are supporting it as a social good, and we want it to be aligned with its social purposes. The way we provision this promise is important because they are created to aggregate what I call actuarial risk pools. So this is stuff that is built on actuarial science to average out actual costs across populations. And the money that gets aggregated into those pools is handed over to fiduciaries who are given plenary powers of discretionary authority about how they put that money to work in the economy in order to earn the money that the whole pension construct needs in order to keep itself ongoing as the forever machine that it is created in the law to be. So let's look next, Isabel. I got this picture of faucets and drains from a guy named John Lakomnik, who used to run the New York City Pension Fund. And I think it's a really interesting way of helping us visualize what's going on, because you've got this actuarial pool, which is a basin of money, and it's constantly being depleted by payments out for administrative costs and current payouts to current retirees. And then we have to replenish those depletions in order to keep the level in the pool at the right level so that this forever machine keeps going on forever. And there are two ways we replenish. One is worker earnings for current workers who are future retirees. And the other one is generating cash flow from financing activities. And you have to make sure that the worker earnings and the cash flow from financings are at the levels that the actuaries have specified in order for this machine to keep on working the way it's designed to work. And if the cash flow earnings from the financing activities come up short, that puts pressure on the earnings. More money has to be kicked in, or the payouts are going to have to be abated. So it's a giant balancing act that we're dealing with. And I think if you look at the language of growth and the dynamic of balancing, you can begin to see there's a strain there between growing and balancing. So next one, Isabel. I like this picture because I think the way to really think about this as a reliable forever machine is to go back to the 18th century to the old water wheels, which would drive a flour mill. And I think what's happening here is very much what's happening with the way the pension is supposed to work. You've got the economy flowing water in the form of money, and sometimes the river runs high and sometimes the river runs low, But what the water wheel needs is to just carve off a steady stream that flows at the same rate so that this wheel just keeps turning over and over again at the right speed to turn the mill, to grind the grain and create the flour so that the people have our daily bread. And it's this whole construct of daily bread that I think is running afoul of the growth imperative that we've gotten ourselves trapped into. So next slide, Isabel. Now let's take a step back and say, now that we understand that there's an enormous amount of money locked into this forever machine, we can begin to see the powers that this construct has to achieve its purpose of being there forever. Includes size, it's very, very large amounts of money. Purpose, it's very programmatic in how it's supposed to operate. And time, it's what I call evergreen. It just keeps going. This comes from a clause that I used to write into my contracts when I was a young contracts lawyer, where contracts would continue automatically unless the parties agreed by notice to terminate them. And we call that an evergreen clause in the contract. And I think pensions are very much the ultimate evergreen contract. Up until the 1980s, we come up with some technology innovations that I lived through, but probably are not that innovative to this audience. But we had spreadsheet math, we had desktop publishing, and we had remote real-time video communication. And that gives pension fiduciaries this power to negotiate. And what they can be negotiating for are these minimum cash flows coming from fiduciary grade enterprises. So let's look at the last slide. So now okay. Yeah, so we've got these purpose of these forever machines and this power to negotiate, which I think should call into question the fiduciary bona fides of the current law of growth as an investment thesis and ownership as a structure for the financing, a legal construct, and purchase for resale as a financing. I think ownership creates a loyalty to what is owned. Purchase for resale creates a loyalty to the selling price of what is purchased. And, you know, I think when you look at the loyalty to what you own and what you're selling, you're really not undivided from your loyalty to your perpetuating yourself forever. So there's a division of loyalties being introduced by this growth investment thesis when the law requires undivided loyalty to the purpose of being there forever. And what we get to is this untaken safer alternative of an equity payback to an actuarial cost of money plus some upside from cash flows that have been prioritized by agreement in a contract for suitability, for longevity, and for what I call the 6 fairnesses of trade, engagement, reckoning, working, dealing, and sharing. And these are the conversations that we as lawyers who begin to interpret fiduciary duty get a voice where we can speak for the future about what is fair and what is perhaps not fair when they construct these dealings. So I'll wrap up my formal presentation, Isabel, with the last slide, which is just this sort of dashboard that I put together to kind of highlight that, you know, you can talk about sustainability in terms of whether or not the business proposition fits the times, understanding what the vision is for how that business is going to fit into the economy. Something that I think is interesting but really technical about the completeness and cohesiveness of the business plan around the knowledge and the networks and the routines that business is executing and being informed by. And then you can look at longevity and fairness by looking at the sort of growth chart, the S-curve for how a business is going to grow and eventually reach stability. And then the most important one is the prioritizing cash flows in budget allocations. And what I'm going to talk to Chris a little bit about is how we can bring not just professionals, but people who care from the general population into conversations about these issues through deliberative processes. On the technical side, you've got all this financial modeling that has to be done to figure out who's going to get what and what's going to be there. And then for us as lawyers, a lot of negotiation over what I call the private laws of negotiating agreements that will give legal meaning and consequence to the modeled expectations that get worked out in designing the investment. So there's a lot of voice there. Yeah, go ahead. So anyway, so there's a lot of voice there for us as professionals. And then I think with Chris, we want to explore how that gives voice to other people in the community. So Chris, maybe I'll invite you to give a little bit of an introduction on yourself.
Sure. Okay. I loved your water wheel, by the way. I'm a research scientist by training, and that water wheel matches very nicely with the global boundary with sunlight coming in and then leaving as infrared radiation. So it's beautiful. So yeah, I've been a scientist for 25 years, working for a bunch of big organizations, defense and Cambridge, Northwestern. Currently a research scientist at a company called TOSO. But a long time ago, the planet. And at first I thought I could go and invent some clever technology to do it. And then I realized, well, actually, we have the technology. What we don't have is the quality of conversation that we need with the politicians, the public, lawyers, and different groups. And this is what led me through a laborious process, twisty-turny path to set up this deliberation gateway, which is a thematic network of the Royal Society for the Arts. I came across this concept of deliberative democracy, which holds that the legitimacy stems from the quality of an argumentation. And when I looked at our system, the way that it is, we're not seeing really high quality argumentation among our politicians. And there's all kinds of private third party sort of pressures on making those decisions. So anyway, that's me. So that's what I'm here today to talk about, is a little bit about deliberative democracy and how it meshes in with what Tim's talking about. And I think I'm really excited because this is like two groups of people who are kind of converging on this kind of thought. And I've heard of other groups of people coming to similar conclusions. How do we get public participatory input in these vast sums of money?
And when we first started talking, what interested me is deliberative democracy.
That's where I'm at. Yeah, go on.
Deliberative democracy, I've seen before, is really focused on sort of governance and politics and lawmaking. But what I'm pointing to, pensions and an interpretation of fiduciary duty that is an evolving conversation that always has to be refreshed to keep current. Can we go from lawmaking to a form of litigation which is not adjudicatory? And you and I have been talking, Chris, about this idea of creating advisory trials where citizen juries would sit in a sort of quasi-litigation kind of constructs to have conversations, to improve the argumentation around, what's fair and what's not fair, what's suitable, where should this money go, where can it be going, how can it be constructed?
I think there's a lot of there's been a lot of research into how to do deliberative democracy going back 30, 40 years, a lot of academic work, and there's been a lot of trial runs all around the world for different processes, and they're very flexible in terms of like how they can be used. There's many different ways in which you can sort of get a group of people and bring them into a room and then have a conversation. And in fact, I was going to talk a little bit about the history of, I'll bring up, if we can move forward to the slide that says Aristotle, and I will just skip through from my slides here. So Aristotle had this really interesting kind of position in history where, he was an observer in an ancient Athenian democracy, the original democracy, and they had a system where they would pick people by lottery. They had a system that picked some people by elections. So Aristotle was able to look at this and see what the consequences of these different selection processes were on the quality of the output decisions. And he said it's accepted as democratic when the offices are allocated by lot and oligarchic when they're filled by election. And there's this kind of interplay between electoral processes and the creation of oligarchs who have, private vested interest, huge sums of money, and they're making decisions for themselves, and that's having a huge effect on everybody else. Whereas democracy it emerges when you get a random selection of people and put them in the room. So there's different. You've got to ask this question: who is having this quality conversation? How are they arguing? What are they arguing about? And then how does that become law? So having lotteries is a way to choose a broader range of people and put them into the driving seat. But you've got to have the right processes in the background in order for that to make sense. So I think you can design participatory processes for lots of different purposes, not just for assessing laws, but I think I mean, the jury in a court of law is essentially a version of it, right?
Right,
Yeah,
right.
and yeah, so I think they can be adapted to work in novel context. Yeah, so I'm thinking.
One of the things that I'm seeing from my point of entry is, who's having these conversations about where pension money should go right now? Well, it's all market professionals. It's all experts in buying stock at one price to sell at another. And really, in that conversation, you and I, the legal community, the people who care, the democracy doesn't have a voice, because you can't debate whether to buy or sell. You got to have a gut feel for that, And I spent a year in that business, and it was not a wasted year, because I got a very personal sense of just how instinctive being successful in that space really, really is. But we need pension money not to be driven by instinct. It needs to be driven by thoughtfulness and consideration and a reckoning with the consequences. So I'm seeing some very strong parallels between what you're talking about, between election and other democratic processes, and how we can use this to bring legal voices and just common voices into common sense, and put common sense back into trillions and trillions of dollars in shaping the future that we want to be living in.
Right, and I can speak to that. Like, how do you engage experts in one of these kinds of I want to look at the slide that says the US is an oligarchy. If we can just fast forward to that one. And so this is just a picture that I put together to sort of show a few concepts, really. And at the moment, we've got this idea, we've got these rich donors who have, conversations, they have their own perspectives, their own huge amounts of money, and they often fund lobbyists and think tanks. They're all getting donations. And a lot of the draft legislation is created by this sort of political elite who write these draft legislation bills, pop them into the government, and then they argue about it, and then they come out with the laws. But the same donors are paying for the election campaigns for these political parties. And often what people are talking about in the population isn't what is going through Congress. Okay? There's this kind of disconnect. And the study on the right showed how if you would think in a democracy that if 70% of the population favored a policy, then there was 0.7% likely to get in power. So you'd expect a straight line going through the origin up to the top right. But when you separate people's preferences and then look at the different demographics and how their preferences are then translated into laws, you find that the average person in the US has absolutely no impact on the law whatsoever, none. And the political elite control essentially what those policies are. And there's a whole discussion about how elections affect the psychology of individuals. When you pick someone by lottery, they have a very different mindset than someone who's selected by an election. Someone who's selected by an election feels like really important and powerful, and it corrupts essentially. So I think how experts get involved is really important. Like at the moment, they're kind of coming in through these lobbyists and think tanks. And if we can just, I'm going to fast forward to the slide with the other graphic on it. There's no title. When I'll tell you when. Keep going. Yeah. We're going to go backwards and forwards a little bit. Next one. Yes, this one. So here, when you have a lottery, we have this phrase in deliberative democracy, which is called experts on tap, not on top. And this blue box at the bottom represents the entire population, which also includes everyone who works for a company, everyone who's an expert in whatever, and you can take a random lottery and get a cohort of people. But the experts can be selected to help inform that group, but it's the group themselves who are making the decision. And just in the way that it is done in a court, where you have sort of process and content is kind of separate. You have kind of court officers. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I've never even been in a court, to be honest, but they have court officers, you know, who are running the show, you know, but they don't actually get involved in the argument. You know, and any content is brought in by the lawyers and the people presenting evidence. So you have the separation of content and process. And there's a whole group of new organizations that have just popped up who are really good at doing this, running these kinds of events, linking in information, and quite often in big deliberative processes, the deliberative cohort has the power to call particular experts. Like if I want to speak to the CEO of Enron or whatever, I can bring them out. Or, you know, if I want, you know, and you can, whatever legal framework has kind of commissioned process, that process has the power of that legal framework, right? You know, so if the president of the US said this, or if a select committee said, you know, we're going to have a public consultation, you know, select committee can pull anyone they want really into giving evidence. So so you can have a whole range of experts who suddenly they're not involved behind the scenes with lobbyists and people like that. They're actually giving testimony in front of a random lottery of people, and it becomes a very different kind of way in which that information informs this group. And how that eventual report gets turned into a law. Well, the hope is that if we run enough of these events and processes around the world, and there have been now thousands of these things worldwide, that people would start to trust the output. And that report, you know, in the long run, the hope is that just having one of these citizens' assemblies would be enough to generate a report, which then becomes a law. But right now, you need to engage existing power structures, elected people to say, okay, I want to have the output of this. And there's a whole bunch of discussions and arguments about the best way of combining lotteries, lottery-driven citizen participation processes and elected incumbents, all of which can include experts. So I think, yeah, this gives you kind of a quick overview of how these things are kind of organized, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But yeah, well, so I'm excited that it could work in the judiciary side as well. There's many ways that it could be deployed.
Yeah, you know, I'm looking at your box titled New Law and saying, well, this would actually become an evolving common sense in the context of, you know, pension money and where it should go. And although it's never really going to tell the pensions where they should put their money, because at the end of the day, we've entrusted them with that judgment, it informs them. And I know people say, well, how are you going to make them do this? And it's a little bit of a trust construct that we need to build, but we need to be able to inform that trust construct in a way that it isn't right now. And, you know, this apparatus, I think, for lack of a better word, is a really good way of bringing more and more voices into establishing what the common law is. And then, you know, ultimately, if you've got rogue pension investors who continually encounter evidence that common sense is this, and they're saying, no, we're not going to do that because we want to extract too much profit over here, you know, there's accountability for that.
Right. And it is ultimately their money, right? The random people that you're picking is essentially their money. So there's this really strong kind of just basic sort of, I don't know what to say, what the right word is, like morality in the sense that they should have a say in what happens. And if we could jump to the slide that says legitimacy through process, I can make a few comments. Go back. We have to go back. Yeah. So, yeah. So there's a right way and a wrong way to manage a crowd of random people and get them to provide with wisdom or insight, whatever the output is, right? And in fact, the founding fathers knew about ancient Greece and lotteries, and they deliberately chose to have elections because they knew that it would create oligarchs. Right? They knew that. They wanted to find the natural aristocracy who would come up. They'd be the more enlightened individuals. They just wanted anybody to have the chance to become that enlightened individual, right? But they wanted to have an oligarchy, not a democracy. But when But so, and they feared mob rule. They feared, like, if we just got a group of people, put them in a room and got them to, they would just be this mob. And when you look at a conventional town hall, that's much more what it's like, right? And you've seen this kind of meetings before, and elected individuals hate going to these meetings, right? Because they're standing up there on the front of the stage, they're getting yelled at by all of these people, and it's always the same people who come forward to argue about everything. The people who want the dam to be built, the people who want the dam to be destroyed, whatever it is, they're coming in and yelling, and everybody gets like one or two sentences, and the quality of the conversation is extremely low. And it's much more like the mob rule that the founding fathers didn't want.
Right.
Flip over to how it looks in a more modern deliberation on the other side. Sorry, on the previous, staying on the same slide, I just want to look at the picture on the other side of the screen where it says deliberative town hall. You can just see it's the same room, basically, same number of people. There's a top table, but they're managing the process, and then the layout and the conversation is completely different. So just how you handle one of these conversations, splitting out into breakups, everybody gets to talk to all these different people. You get to hear a much wider range of points of view. You begin to see, instead of seeing your political enemies as other, instead of seeing, the Democrats or Republicans as evil, you end up seeing them as human beings. You see the person on the other side of the table as a human. And, and if you're asking this group of people to decide how to invest, or what should be the guidelines for investing trillions of dollars, they're going to start seeing the humanity of the situation. They're going to start seeing children in the future, 7 generations of children in the future. It's a very different process to being in a room as an elected person and defending your party, defending whether or not you're going to get elected again, how, which side of the conversation you're on in my diagram in the 2 halves. Are you on this sort of convincing people to vote for your side, or are you in the behind the scenes conversation? So these kinds of conversations are very different. They're qualitatively different, and they provide, core thesis of deliberative democracy is that legitimacy arises from the quality of the argument. You need to have this broad diversity of input into this conversation in order to discover the most legitimate course of action. And this is what dictators do, isn't it? They cut people out who say things they don't like, so that they're not around when they make their decision. And then there's, lo and behold, is the best argument in the room, because everybody who dare say otherwise would get shot. So, that's not a high quality process. Here, we're really listening to everyone and seeing everyone as a human being. So I think you get a much better quality of output. There's a lot more time spent learning. Your average politician on a really complex topic like this one, like, fiduciary responsibility, they're not going to spend, if there's a vote in Parliament, they're going to vote the way their party tells them to, and that'll be on their basis of a think tank of 5 people, who had a little discussion, maybe made a spreadsheet, and then decided what to do. But here we're going to have a much more in-depth learning process. The first half of every deliberation is the public learning high quality information, and these people are, business owners, they're scientists, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're average, normal people, right, who are absolutely capable of learning a lot of information. These people are capable of making complicated decisions about who they're going to marry, what kind of career they're going to have. All these things are happening, but you get a wide range of voices and a lot of learning, and it's kind of managed by these people who are organizing the process, but not the content. And so, that gives you a kind of feel for how these kind of deliberations work and the kind of advantages it would have over other forms of, decision making. And I absolutely think it would work in this context as well. Asking people to make this decision about their money. So,
and I can see your deliberative version on the left. These things would be happening all over the place, because these giant global decisions that humanity has to come to some sort of an alignment on. So it's going to be the same conversation, but with different voices in different places.
Right.
And then, that creates a whole new possibility for sort of solutions journalism, where there's a whole social and press media kind of conversation around what people are saying about things like, how do we reconstruct our energy economy? What should we be doing with our water services? What do we deal with soil? I mean, you get some really big conversations, but they don't all reduce to a vote on a legislation. So it's to some extent, it's much more open and evolving. When your purpose for talking is to give some guidance to pension fiduciaries about where the tens of trillions that they control can and should be going in the world. I think it's a really exciting innovation in how we can be together on a planetary scale.
Yeah. And yeah, it works at multiple scales, locally, nationally. There's been some international ones all the way across the EU, where they've had 27 languages in these kinds of things, right down to, local town halls. So there's plenty of examples. There's about 3,000 examples on the Participedia. Maybe you go to that map at the end. I mean, that just shows you a little bit about where these things have been taking place. So there's plenty of examples to draw on. The Participedia.net has a huge number of case studies.
Right.
Oxford Handbook of Deliberative Democracies, it's the output of the academia on the subject. Basically, it's like a compressed sort of summary of all of the thinking and studying. So that's a great place to go to learn more about the nuts and bolts. And you can use it from local situations like homelessness in Los Angeles, right the way through to constitutional changes, which is what happened in Ireland, where they changed the constitution on abortion. I'm sure some of you heard about that. And in the context of this conversation, in Melbourne, there have already been participatory processes deciding what to do with $5 billion. So they're already starting to get up to these kinds of numbers. And and given that, the overriding argument, I've said it already, that it's their money, they get to choose. So yeah, hopefully that gives everyone an overview. I'm conscious of time. I can talk about this for days